The lawyer's pen scratched against the paper like fingernails on a chalkboard, each stroke sealing what felt like the final verdict on 43 years of my life. I watched Margaret Chen's manicured fingers adjust her reading glasses as she reviewed the will one more time, her expression professionally neutral despite the bombshell I'd just dropped in her downtown Chicago office. "Mr. Morrison, I need to confirm you understand the implications of this decision," she said, her voice carrying that careful tone lawyers use when they think their client might be losing his mind. "You're leaving your entire estate, the house in Naperville, your 401k, life insurance, everything, to Miss Rodriguez, a woman you've known for, what did you say, 3 months?" "4 months," I corrected, shifting in the leather chair that probably cost more than most people made in a week. The cancer had eaten away at my frame until these fancy office chairs felt like sitting on concrete. And yes, I understand perfectly. Every goddamn penny goes to Carmen. Margaret's eyebrows twitched at my language, but she'd been my attorney long enough to know I wasn't the country club type, even if I could afford the membership. "And your family? Your wife Sarah? Your children?" "Ex-wife," I cut her off, the words tasting bitter as chemotherapy. "And my kids made their position crystal clear 6 months ago when Dr. Patterson gave me the diagnosis. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, maybe 8 months if I was lucky." You know what my loving family's first concern was? Whether I'd updated my insurance beneficiaries. The memory hit me like a sucker punch to the gut. Sarah sitting in that same doctor's office, her face pale, not from grief, but from calculations running behind her eyes. 22 years of marriage, and the first words out of her mouth weren't, "Well, fight this together," or "What do we do now?" They were, "Dave, we need to talk about the financial arrangements." My son Jake, 25 and fresh out of law school, had nodded along like a bobblehead, already thinking about how to protect the family assets during what he clinically called my final phase. My daughter Emma, 23 and working at some startup in Austin, had flown in for exactly 1 weekend before declaring she couldn't handle the emotional intensity and needed to maintain her mental health boundaries. Mental health boundaries? Christ! "They didn't abandon you because of money, Dave," Sarah had said during our last real conversation, standing in the kitchen of the house we'd bought when Jake was in middle school. She was packing her things into boxes marked in her precise handwriting. "We abandoned you because you've been impossible to live with for years. The cancer just made it easier to admit." Maybe she was right. Maybe I had been impossible. Working 60-hour weeks at the engineering firm, missing recitals and soccer games and family dinners because someone had to pay for the private schools and the SUVs and the family vacations to places I never wanted to go. Maybe I had turned into the kind of man who grunted responses to his wife's attempts at conversation and fell asleep watching SportsCenter instead of asking about his kids' days. But when the chips were down, when I was staring death in the face and needed them most, they'd scattered like roaches when the lights come on. "Mr. Morrison?" Margaret's voice pulled me back to the present. "Are you certain about this?" I looked out her office window at the Chicago skyline, all glass and steel reaching toward a gray November sky. Somewhere down there, Carmen Rodriguez was probably finishing her shift at Northwestern Memorial, checking on patients who meant nothing to her family but everything to someone else's. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Carmen had walked into my hospital room on a Tuesday morning in July when the summer heat was already making the city shimmer like a mirage. I'd been expecting another round of the usual suspects, the parade of nurses who treated terminal patients like inconvenient speed bumps on their way to more hopeful cases. Instead, I got this compact woman with graying hair pulled back in a neat ponytail and eyes that actually looked at me instead of through me. "Mr. Morrison? I'm Carmen Rodriguez, your primary nurse. How are we feeling today?" "Like shit," I'd answered, because why sugarcoat it? Most nurses would have given me the practiced smile and launched into some speech about maintaining a positive attitude. Carmen had nodded and said, "Yeah, pancreatic cancer will do that to you. The pain medication helping at all? Or should we adjust the dosage?" Just like that. No bullshit, no false cheer, no treating me like a child who couldn't handle reality. She talked to me like a man who knew he was dying and preferred honesty over hope. Over the next 4 months, as my body systematically shut down and my family systematically checked out, Carmen became the one constant in my shrinking world. She worked the day shift, Monday through Friday, and somehow always found time to actually talk to me instead of just checking boxes on a chart. "You worked construction before engineering," she'd asked one afternoon in August, settling into the chair beside my bed during what I'd learned was her lunch break. "Yeah, right out of high school. Figured I'd do that forever, but my old man convinced me to use the GI Bill and get an education. Said he didn't want me breaking my back for 30 years like he did. Smart man. Stubborn man. Difference being he was usually right about being stubborn." I'd paused, watching her unwrap a sandwich that looked homemade. "You don't have to spend your lunch break with me, you know. I'm sure you've got better things to do." Carmen had taken a bite of her sandwich and shrugged. "My husband's been dead 3 years. My kids are grown and scattered across the country, too busy with their own lives to call more than once a month. You want to know the truth? You're better company than most people I know." That's when I'd started really looking at her, not as the nurse, but as Carmen. She was maybe 55, with the kind of practical beauty that came from decades of caring for other people instead of herself. Her wedding ring was gone, but I could see the pale line where it used to be. Her scrubs were always clean and pressed, but I'd noticed she wore the same pair of white Nikes every day, worn down at the heels from 12-hour shifts on hospital floors. "What happened to your husband?" I'd asked, surprised by my own curiosity. "Heart attack. Massive one, at 59. He was fixing the neighbor's fence on a Saturday morning, and just gone." She'd said it matter-of-factly, the way people talk about tragedies that have had time to settle into acceptance. 34 years of marriage, and I had about 15 minutes warning before it was over. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. Miguel had a good life. Died doing something kind for someone else. There are worse ways to go." She'd looked at me then with those direct brown eyes. "You're going to ask me how I cope with it, right? Everyone does." "Actually, I was going to ask if you miss him." The question had surprised her, I could tell. Every day. But missing him and being stuck in grief are different things. Miguel wouldn't want me to stop living because he did. That conversation had stayed with me through the weeks that followed as my condition deteriorated and my family's visits became more sporadic. Sarah had moved out completely by September, citing the need to start her healing process. Jake and Emma called dutifully every Sunday evening, conversations that lasted exactly long enough to ease their consciences without actually requiring them to engage with the reality of my situation. But Carmen was there every weekday morning at 7 a.m. sharp, checking my vitals and asking real questions about how I was feeling, what I needed, whether the pain was manageable. She brought me books when I mentioned being bored, not inspirational cancer-fighting memoirs, but actual novels and biographies I might enjoy. When I lost my appetite, she didn't lecture me about nutrition. She asked what sounded good and somehow convinced the kitchen staff to bend the rules. "You've got family coming for Thanksgiving?" she'd asked in late November, adjusting my IV bag with practiced efficiency. "Nope. Sarah's got the kids this year." Something about not wanting the holiday to be dominated by sadness. I'd tried to keep the bitterness out of my voice, but Carmen was too perceptive to miss it. "That's rough." "It's honest, at least." No point pretending we're the Waltons when we never were. Carmen had paused in her chart notations. "What about your friends? People from work?" Most of my friends were really Sarah's friends. And work? Well, let's just say when you're not going to be around to work on future projects, people start treating you like you're already gone. "So you'll be here for the holiday?" "Looks like it. But hey, at least the hospital does a pretty decent turkey dinner, or so I'm told. Actually, Carmen had said, her voice careful in a way that immediately got my attention, I was thinking, if you're up for it, you could come to my place. I mean, if you're allowed to leave for a few hours and want some company. I usually just make a small dinner for myself anyway. I'd stared at her, genuinely shocked. You want to spend Thanksgiving with a dying man you barely know? I want to spend Thanksgiving with a friend who shouldn't have to eat hospital food on a holiday, but only if you want to. No pressure. Friend. When was the last time someone had called me that? The Thanksgiving dinner at Carmen's small apartment in Pilsen had been the best meal I'd had in months, and not just because of her excellent cooking. Her place was tiny but immaculate, filled with family photos and books, and the kind of comfortable clutter that comes from actually living somewhere instead of just existing there. She'd made traditional Mexican dishes alongside the turkey, tamales and rice and beans that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with Chicago's food scene decades ago. Miguel taught me to cook, she explained, serving me portions that were realistic for my diminished appetite. He said a Puerto Rican woman who couldn't make proper sofrito was a disgrace to her ancestors. Was he right? God, no. I'm a terrible cook by his family's standards, but I'm better than I was when we met, and that's something. We'd talked for hours that afternoon, about everything and nothing. Her childhood in Humboldt Park, back when it was still rough around the edges. My own upbringing on the South Side, son of a steel worker who'd pushed education like it was salvation itself. Her decision to become a nurse after watching her mother die slowly in a hospital where the staff treated poor patients like inconveniences. My choice to specialize in structural engineering because I liked the idea of building things that would outlast me. Ironic, isn't it? I'd said as the afternoon faded toward evening. Spent my whole career designing buildings to stand for 100 years, and I won't even see next summer. Maybe, or maybe you built something else that'll last longer. Like what? Carmen had shrugged, clearing plates with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to taking care of others. Like being the kind of man who notices when his nurse spends her lunch break with him instead of in the break room. Like asking real questions instead of just making small talk. Like caring about whether someone misses their dead husband. That night, lying in my hospital bed and thinking about the first genuinely pleasant day I'd had in months, I'd started formulating the plan that had brought me to Margaret Chen's office. The thing is, I told Margaret now, watching her pen hover over the signature line, Carmen doesn't know about this. She's been taking care of me for 4 months without knowing I have any money at all. When she spends her breaks sitting with me, it's not because she thinks I'm good for a tip. When she brings me books or asks about my pain levels or listens to me talk about my shitty family, it's because she gives a damn about me as a person. But Mr. Morrison, she's a professional caregiver. It's her job to— No, I cut her off more sharply than I'd intended. It's her job to monitor my medication and change my IV and make sure I don't develop bed sores. Spending her lunch breaks with me, bringing me novels, inviting me to Thanksgiving dinner, that's not in any job description. That's just who she is. Margaret was quiet for a moment, studying my face. And your family? They'll contest this will, you know. They'll claim undue influence, diminished capacity due to medication. Let them try. I've been off the heavy pain meds for a week specifically so I could make this decision with a clear head. And I've got 4 months of medical records showing I'm mentally competent. Plus, every conversation I've had with Carmen has been witnessed by other hospital staff. She's never once asked me about money or hinted that she expected anything from me. I'd been thinking about this for weeks, ever since the day in early December when Carmen had mentioned, almost in passing, that she was worried about retirement. Her husband's medical bills had eaten through most of their savings before he died, and she was 55 years old, working as a floor nurse with a bad back and arthritic hands. I'll probably work until I drop, she'd said, stretching her fingers after a particularly long shift. At least I like what I do. That's more than most people can say. She'd never complained, never played the victim, never hinted that life had been unfair to her. But I'd seen the way she winced when she thought no one was looking, the careful way she moved after 12 hours on her feet, the resignation in her voice when she talked about the future. Meanwhile, my loving family was already planning how to divide up assets I'd spent a lifetime accumulating. Jake had actually brought me real estate listings last week just to give you an idea of the market value of the house. Emma had asked about my pension plan and whether there were any tax implications she should know about. Sarah had moved on so completely she was already dating someone, a fact I'd learned not from her, but from our neighbor who'd seen them together at the grocery store. I told Margaret, reaching for the pen with hands that shook slightly from the medication, "And make sure it's ironclad. I want them to know exactly why they're getting nothing." Margaret slid the document across her desk. "I'll need witnesses." "Already arranged. Your secretary and the paralegal down the hall." As I signed my name on each page, I thought about Carmen's face when she'd learn about this after I was gone. She'd probably be shocked, maybe even angry at first. She'd wonder if she'd somehow taken advantage of me without meaning to. But eventually, I hoped, she'd understand that this wasn't about gratitude or guilt or trying to buy friendship from beyond the grave. This was about making sure that, for once in my adult life, I'd done something for someone who deserved it instead of someone who expected it. 2 weeks later, I was back in my hospital room when Dr. Patterson delivered the news I'd been expecting. The cancer had spread more aggressively than they'd hoped. We were looking at days, maybe a week or two if I was lucky. "I can increase the pain medication," he offered, his voice carrying the practiced gentleness doctors use when they're essentially announcing someone's execution date. "Not yet. I want to stay clear for a while longer." Carmen was there, as she always was, standing by the window and pretending to adjust the blinds, while giving the doctor and me privacy for what we both knew was probably our last serious conversation. After Dr. Patterson left, she turned back to me with that direct gaze I'd come to value so much. "How you feeling about all this?" "Honestly? Pissed off. I always figured I'd have more time to get things right." "Get what things right?" I considered the question seriously. My relationship with my kids, maybe? Try to understand where things went wrong with Sarah. Figure out if I was really the bastard everyone seems to think I am, or if we just grew into people who couldn't stand each other. Carmen pulled the chair closer to my bed and sat down. "You want my opinion?" "Always. I think you're a man who spent 40 years trying to be what everyone else needed you to be. And now you're dying before you figured out who you actually were underneath all that." The observation hit me like a physical blow, not because it was cruel, but because it was true. I had spent decades being the provider, the problem solver, the man who handled everything so everyone else could focus on living their lives. Somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten that I was supposed to have a life too. "What about you?" I asked. "Did you ever figure out who you were underneath being a wife and mother and caregiver?" Carmen was quiet for a long moment. "I'm working on it. Miguel's death forced me to start asking those questions. Losing him was terrible, but in some weird way, it also freed me to start thinking about what I wanted instead of what everyone else needed." "And what do you want?" "Small things, mostly. To travel a little, maybe take a photography class, to have conversations with interesting people instead of just taking care of them. To not worry about money every month." She smiled, a little sadly. "To matter to someone who isn't dying." That last comment hung in the air between us, heavy with implications neither of us wanted to address directly. Because the truth was, we had become important to each other in ways that went beyond nurse and patient. In the months since my family had abandoned ship, Carmen had become my closest friend, the person I most looked forward to seeing each day. And I was dying. "Carmen," I started, then stopped. "How do you tell someone they've saved your life when your life is almost over anyway?" "What is it, Dave?" "Nothing. Just thank you. For everything. For treating me like a person instead of a diagnosis. for giving a damn about whether I was comfortable or scared or lonely, for being the kind of friend I probably didn't deserve but definitely needed. She reached over and squeezed my hand, her fingers warm and strong from decades of caring for others. You did deserve it. And you gave me something too, you know? What's that? You reminded me that I'm good at this. Not just the medical stuff, but the human stuff. The part of nursing that isn't about protocols and procedures, but about seeing people when they're at their most vulnerable and treating them with dignity anyway. That afternoon, after Carmen had finished her shift and gone home, I called Margaret Chen's office and made one final addition to my will, a letter to be delivered to Carmen along with the legal documents, explaining my decision and hoping she'd understand. 3 days later, I slipped into unconsciousness for the last time. Carmen was there, holding my hand and talking quietly about her plans for the weekend, her voice a steady anchor in the growing darkness. The last thing I remember thinking was that I was grateful to die surrounded by kindness instead of obligation. Margaret Chen called Carmen a week after the funeral to inform her about the inheritance. According to Margaret, Carmen had been silent for nearly a full minute before asking if this was some kind of mistake. No mistake, Ms. Rodriguez. Mr. Morrison was very specific about his wishes. But I don't understand. Why would he? We weren't. I was just doing my job. Actually, he left you a letter explaining his decision. Would you like me to read it to you, or would you prefer to receive a copy? Carmen had chosen to hear it immediately, standing in her small apartment kitchen while Margaret read my words over the phone. Carmen, by the time you hear this, I'll be gone, and you'll probably be confused as hell about why a dying man you knew for 4 months left you everything he owned. I want you to understand this isn't about guilt or gratitude or some misguided attempt to buy my way into heaven. This is about justice. For 43 years, I gave everything I had to people who took it for granted. I worked myself into an early grave to provide for a family that couldn't wait to forget about me the moment I became inconvenient. I spent decades trying to be the man everyone else needed, and when I finally needed them, they disappeared. But you didn't disappear. You showed up every day, not because you had to, but because that's who you are. You cared about my comfort, my dignity, my fear, my loneliness. You treated a dying stranger with more kindness than my own family showed me. The money, about $850,000 when everything's sold, isn't payment for services rendered. It's recognition of something rare and valuable, a human being who does the right thing simply because it's right. My family will be furious, and they'll probably try to fight this in court. Let them. I've made sure this will is bulletproof, and I've included enough documentation to show exactly why they're getting nothing. They chose to abandon me when I needed them. You chose to stay. Use the money however you want. Travel, take those photography classes, buy a house, retire early, whatever makes you happy. You've earned the right to think about yourself for a change. And Carmen, don't feel guilty about this. You didn't manipulate me or take advantage of me. You simply treated a dying man like he mattered, and that meant everything to me. Thank you for making my last months bearable. Thank you for being my friend when no one else would. Thank you for showing me that kindness still exists in the world. With gratitude and respect, Dave Morrison. P.S. In the front bedroom closet of the house, there's a box marked Emma's baby clothes. Inside, you'll find the original copy of this letter and all the documentation about my family's behavior over the past 6 months. Keep it safe, just in case. According to Margaret, Carmen had cried. Not from joy, but from a kind of overwhelmed grief for a friendship that had been cut short just as it was becoming something real and lasting. The legal challenges came exactly as I'd predicted. Sarah hired her own attorney and filed papers claiming I'd been mentally compromised by medication and pain. Jake and Emma joined the lawsuit, arguing that their father's tragic illness had made him susceptible to manipulation by opportunistic healthcare workers. But I'd been thorough. Every conversation with Carmen had been documented in my medical records. The hospital's security cameras had recorded our interactions in public areas. Dr. Patterson testified that I'd been mentally competent throughout my treatment. Most damning of all was the evidence I'd left behind: recordings of phone conversations with my family, emails showing their primary concerns had been financial from the moment of my diagnosis, and testimony from hospital staff about their absence during my final months. The case was settled out of court after 3 months. My family received nothing. Carmen kept everything, exactly as I'd intended. She used part of the money to buy a small house in a quiet neighborhood near the hospital, with a garden where she could grow the vegetables Miguel had always loved. She enrolled in the photography classes she'd mentioned, and her pictures of Chicago's hidden corners and quiet moments started appearing in local galleries. But she also kept working as a nurse, at least part-time. According to the friends we'd made at Northwestern Memorial, she said she wasn't ready to give up the work that had given her life meaning for so many years. "Dave Morrison taught me something important," she told a reporter who'd gotten wind of the story and wanted to write about it. "He showed me that caring for people isn't just a job, it's a way of honoring the best parts of being human. I can't retire from that, even if I don't have to worry about money anymore." The reporter had asked if she felt guilty about inheriting money from a patient's family. "I felt terrible at first," Carmen had admitted, "but then I realized something. Dave wasn't trying to hurt his family by leaving them nothing. He was trying to show them what they'd lost by walking away from him. They lost years of relationship with a good man because they were too focused on what they might inherit to appreciate what they already had." She'd paused, according to the article, looking out the window of her new house toward the garden she was planning. "I think Dave wanted them to understand that love and money aren't the same thing, and that sometimes the people who deserve your generosity most are the ones who never ask for it." 6 months after my death, Carmen visited my grave for the first time. She brought a photograph she'd taken of the sunrise over Lake Michigan, one of the quiet, beautiful moments she'd learned to notice and capture. "I hope you know what you did for me," she said to the headstone, according to the hospital chaplain who'd driven her there. "You didn't just leave me money. You left me proof that kindness matters, that caring for people has value, that doing the right thing sometimes gets rewarded." She'd stood there for a while, the chaplain said, in the silence of the cemetery where the dead rest and the living try to make sense of what they've lost and found. "I miss our conversations," she'd finally said. "I miss having someone to talk to who understood that being a caregiver doesn't mean you stop being a person. But I want you to know, I'm not just surviving. Because of what you did for me, I'm living, really living, maybe for the first time since Miguel died." That's the ending I'd hoped for when I signed those papers in Margaret Chen's office. Not revenge against my family, though their fury and lawsuits had provided a certain grim satisfaction. Not guilt or obligation on Carmen's part, though I'd worried she might feel both. I'd hoped for justice, for recognition that kindness has value, that caring for others matters, that sometimes the people who deserve good things most are the ones who never expect them. It spent 43 years trying to be the man everyone else needed me to be, and I died feeling like I'd failed at everything that really mattered. But in those final months, Carmen had shown me a different way to measure a life's worth, not by how much you accumulated or achieved, but by how you treated the people around you when no one was keeping score. My family had kept score from the moment I got sick, calculating their inheritance and protecting their interests while I faced death alone. Carmen had never kept score at all. She'd simply shown up, day after day, treating a dying stranger with dignity and kindness, because that's who she was. In the end, that made all the difference. Not just for me, but for her, and maybe for everyone whose life she'll touch with the security and freedom my money provided. I'd spent decades building structures designed to outlast me, bridges and buildings that would stand long after I was gone. But the most important thing I ever built was simpler than that. A friendship based on respect and kindness, and a final gesture that honored what really matters. Carmen understood that. My family never did. That's why she got everything, and they got exactly what they'd given me in my final months. Nothing at all. The morning after Carmen's first visit to my grave, she returned to Northwestern Memorial for her regular shift. The same hospital where we'd met, where she'd spent her lunch breaks listening to a dying man talk about his failures and fears. Where she'd learned that sometimes the most important work you do isn't the work you're paid for. She checked on her patients with the same careful attention she'd shown me, asking real questions and listening to real answers. She brought comfort to the frightened and dignity to the dying. She treated each person like they mattered, because in her world, they did. At lunch, she sat in the family waiting area with an elderly woman whose husband was in surgery, offering the kind of quiet companionship that doesn't need words. The same gift she'd given me when I needed it most. Later, filling out charts in the nurses' station, she thought about the photography class she'd start next week, the garden she was planning, the trip to Puerto Rico she might finally take to see the places Miguel had always described. But mostly, she thought about the conversations we'd shared, the friendship that had grown in the shadow of death, and the lesson I'd tried to teach her about the value of kindness in a world that doesn't always reward it. She was living proof that sometimes, just sometimes, it does. And somewhere in the complex equations of memory and meaning that survive us after we're gone, that felt like the closest thing to immortality a man like me was ever going to get.